Israel emerges. You will remember it was the first major country in the world to go back into a second lockdown, and it does look like it has worked in a big way, with new daily cases dropping off a cliff. The country saw around 560 cases Sunday, but that is down from a record 9,000 cases in a single day, as you can see here on the chart, back in late September. That was according to the Israeli Health Ministry. Well, connecting us to this part of the narrative is Oren Liebman, who is in Jerusalem for you. And Oren, what is the lockdown lesson where you are?
Becky, it sounds so familiar to hear those reports from Italy and Wales, because Israel was in that exact situation just a couple of months ago, with among the highest daily coronavirus cases per capita in the world. And that's why it was forced into a second lockdown. If there is a silver lining, and this would be a thin one, it is that the second lockdown worked. It worked quicker than was expected, and it worked without the restrictions being as severe as the first lockdown. People were allowed to venture out a little further. More activities were allowed, and yet the numbers came down anyway. We traveled to a town in the Negev desert called Yeruham to see what it was like there and what they did above and beyond the lockdown. And what I saw, at least from that town, is part of what made it work there was buy-in from the entire community and a level of public trust that seems rare these days. In the heart of the Negev desert, the second wave of coronavirus hit hard. The town of Yeruham was labeled a red zone because of a high infection rate. A second lockdown was inevitable, but it was also embraced.
There was definitely an awareness in the community of the seriousness of the situation and the need for severe measures that would be effective.
The town closed schools early, going above and beyond Ministry of Health requirements. Religious services were moved outdoors before it was mandatory. And in late spring, the mayor created a local contact tracing network, not relying on a national plan.
I need to fight the COVID, and I need to give them hope. I need to work for their immunity, and I must do everything I can that they will trust me.
Across the country, public trust in the national leadership's handling of the coronavirus crisis has plummeted. The different sectors in Israeli society, religious, secular, ultra-Orthodox, and Arab, attacked and blamed each other for a second wave of infections that was much worse than the first. A second general lockdown only exacerbated that bitterness, even as it brought down the numbers.
Anytime you reach the point where you need a lockdown, that's a failure of managing the pandemic. The lockdown itself is likely to work because everybody stays at home, but reaching that point is, in my view, a failure.
Eran Segal at the Weizmann Institute of Science says it was a surprise that Israel's second lockdown worked so quickly. On September 30th, Israel hit more than 9,000 new cases in one day. 3 weeks later, the numbers were down to around 1,000 a day, even though the lockdown was less strict.
All other activities, like allowing people to be more outdoors, to do sports, to drive more, but be kind of more on their own, those are not drivers of the pandemic. So the fact that we allowed those during the second lockdown and not the first didn't have an effect.
Yeruham saw a similar drop, from 27 in a day in September to less than 5 in the last week. Here, they take seriously the commandment to love thy neighbor as thyself.
The country of Israel is like a hand. The hand has a lot of fingers. There is no finger worth more than others. But only all the fingers together can make one hand. A hand without a finger is not a complete hand. The same thing for us. We have many different men and women, everyone with his opinions, desires, ideas, but we are all truly one.
As Israel slowly reopens, there is a fear that it's too soon. The numbers now are significantly worse than they were at the end of the first lockdown in May. Yeruham is not immune to that fear, but here they say their greatest strength is a community united against coronavirus. Professor Segal says one of the key lessons that the rest of the world could learn from Israel is that you shouldn't manage a pandemic and make your decisions based on the capacity of your healthcare system. Why not? Because then you're bound to hit that capacity if that's your metric for making decisions, and that puts undue strain and stress on your healthcare system and perhaps pushes it past the breaking point. Becky?
Which begs the question, and this is a question that, you know, leaders around the world will be asking themselves, by what metrics should decision makers be making their decisions?
The key numbers to look at here are R0 and the change in the infection rate. If the infection rate is growing, if the positivity rate is growing, you have to step back on reopening. As long as that positivity rate continues to decrease, and as Professor Segal says, the outbreak is shrinking in a country, you can move forward on reopening.